time, baby.
Rated PG for parental guidance suggested.
And this is
Thought Crimes.
The number one biggest game is with the king number fame. It's like a race at the top because they wanna be boss. They don't care who they step on as long as they get along. Politicians in my eyes. They thinking less about you, they thinking less about me. As long as they apprehend the place that they want to be, they're always wearing false smiles like they go with the style. Politicians in my eyes.
Rock and roll music, sex, drugs, and partying.
Told it inside, baby, diamond ring. If that diamond ring don't shine, he gonna take it to a private eye. If that private eye can't see.
That's what rock and roll was usually referred to when it started out in predominantly black neighborhoods and black communities. The founders of rock and roll music are Rosetta Tharpe, Bo-Diddley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Screamin' Jay Hawkins. These people were innovative. You had the androgynous style of Little Richard that was boisterous, that was not shameful, that enjoyed rock and roll, that went crazy on the piano, and was innovative in dance moves. You had Screamin' Jay Hawk that brought that dark energy and style, voodoo, things that we later see in punk music and rock and roll from the late 60s to the mid 90s. Then you have guys like Bo-Diddley, pop garage rock and roll music. The guy was innovative on the guitar. His style, his dance moves, later used by a lot of other bands like the Rolling Stones. Along with the GOAT, Chuck Berry, who influenced AC/DC, the Rolling Stones as well, The Who, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Byrds, The Kinks, Grateful Dead, The Animals. In fact, if we're talking about Grateful Dead style, that can again go back to Screamin' Jay Hawkins. These people, these men and women, were the innovators of rock and roll, and they need the respect that is due to them. Even if we're talking about the band Def, who was doing proto-punk in the early 70s, before the Ramones, before Bad Brains, before a lot, if not all, of the later punk bands that came after them. And then again, going back to androgynism, before Prince, you have Little Richard. And this is why people like Rosetta Tharpe, Bo-Diddley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Screamin' Jay Hawkins, and other unsung heroes need to be discussed when it comes to rock and roll music. They are the originators. They are the creators. They are the ones that created rock and roll music. And we need to start putting the kings and queens of this music in their rightful place when it comes to the history. The historical fact that Marilyn Manson and Alice Cooper are also influenced by Screamin' Jay Hawkins. Again, if we're talking about glam rock, alternative rock, punk rock, pop rock, rap metal, grunge, garage, synth pop, rock and roll, all of that can be contributed to these men and women, even if we're just talking about these 5 individuals. And of course, the godmother herself, Rosetta Tharpe, who influenced Chuck Berry, who was one of the first to get on the electric guitar and jam the way she did. She was an amazing front person, an amazing vocalist and guitarist, and that's why she needs to be held even more when it comes to this rock and roll music.
Told it inside, baby, diamond ring. If that diamond ring don't shine, he gonna take it to a private eye. If that private eye can't see. 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 If that private eye can't see.
Now, won't you hear me swinging? Hear the words that I'm singing. Much my soul with water from on high. While the world of love is around me.
You can go to so many subgenres that they created. Even before Elvis came into the picture, you have so many fusions of rock and roll, so many subcategories of rock and roll. And we need to respect these legends and what they brought to the game. So, we're gonna have Prince Solomon do chapter 1, the unsung legends, the originators of rock and roll music.
Rock and roll has been described as the music of sexual fervor, the music of heat and rage. Over the years, rock and roll has been refined over and over in mainstream America, more having to do with the python grip of corporations. Rock and roll has seen many of its black originators, heroes, and legends placed into the abyss. What many in the public are left with are stale, repetitive images of Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis. But who influenced these men, and who are the people who not only influenced, but also birthed rock and roll? Rock and roll formed out of the spirit of early gospel music, primarily sung by black people, and a mixture of jazz, country western, and swing music. The timing and atmosphere was ripe for such a genre to come into fruition. African Americans in the 1930s took time off to rejoice in the music they were able to create from scratch. Starting off from humble beginnings, of course. From the beginning stages all the way through the apex of the genre, rock and roll has always had a distinct African influence. From the animated dance moves to the loud chants, rock and roll was able to take the nation by storm. But as white teenagers began to terrify their parents with this jungle music, as some described it, the originators of the genre began to fade into obscurity. Names like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, credited for influencing the likes of Little Richard, Johnny Cash, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and Jerry Lee Lewis, were also sliding into the abyss of the culture itself. Given the notoriety of many of the successors of Rosetta Tharpe, you would think her name would have more prominence in rock and roll. Born Rosetta Newman on March 20th, 1915 in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, both of Rosetta's parents were singers. She spent the early part of her life traveling with her mother's evangelical troupe. Traveling across the southern parts of the USA, Rosetta was able to sharpen her skills as a performer. As her skills grew, she became known for being more of a musical prodigy. Tharpe originally recorded 4 songs for Decca Records, which were all gospel songs. Rosetta was able to strike a chord with audiences nationwide, and also becoming the first commercially successful gospel artist. With the song, Rock Me, Rosetta was able to snare the imaginations of the next generation of the public and rock and rollers. But aspiring musicians were not the only ones reacting to Tharpe's style of music. Many devout Christian churchgoers were infuriated by the mixing of gospel lyrics and secular sounding instrumentation. Rosetta Tharpe was lighting a fire up under the nation. Tharpe was shaking up the musical scene with genre-bending collaborations with jazz legend Cab Calloway and John Hammond. The fact that Tharpe was able to freely move across musical genres while being a female guitarist seemed like a downright sin itself to many religious folks. Tharpe, after all, was the biggest gospel music star at that time. And as the biggest gospel star, Tharpe was able to play at Carnegie Hall in 1938 with the Dixie Hummingbirds for the troops overseas. Tharpe was the first African American to perform at Carnegie Hall. Rosetta Tharpe's music set the pace to influence later notable acts in rock and roll, as the likes of Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis, who were influenced by Rosetta Tharpe, began to dominate the musical landscape. A regression in the popularity of gospel music began to occur, effectively displacing Tharpe in the long run. Rosetta Tharpe fell victim to a stroke in 1970, causing complications in her speech patterns. She still performed even though the task was extremely taxing on her body. She died October 9, 1973, in Philadelphia. Screamin' Jay Hawkins, best known for the popular song I Will Put a Spell on You, is a pioneer of shock rock. Shock rock is a collective of rock and metal with theatrical live performances that pushes for shock value. Children of Screamin' Jay Hawkins' shock rock are Jimi Hendrix, Kiss, Iggy Pop, and Marilyn Manson. Hawkins was an avid classical pianist at an early age and began to play the guitar in his 20s. Prior to music, Hawkins was originally a middleweight boxing champion of Alaska. Moving into music, Hawkins wanted a different approach than his contemporaries. He found a knack for fancy wardrobes and lively entrances. Hawkins recorded his biggest hit in 1956, I'll Put a Spell on You. The original recording of the song featured Hawkins' band being drunk and grunting and burping in the background. The record label did a recut of the song, removing the random noises in the background of the song. The song I'll Put a Spell on You was still banned in some parts of the country. Because of Hawkins' eccentric ways and sometimes slightly sexual innuendos, many radio stations were reluctant to play some of his records. Hawkins went on to add more props to his performances, such as coffins, rubber snakes, crystals, and his signature smoking crystal skull on his stick. Hawkins became a pioneer in live performances and the progenitor of shock rock. Everything about his life was extravagant, including his love for women. It is stated that he may have sired over 57 children. As on the stage and in life, Hawkins was truly a shock rocker. Bo-Diddley and Chuck Berry considered to be the two great guitars in rock music. Both Bo-Diddley and Chuck Berry were good friends, and both played for Chess Records. Bo-Diddley was born December 30th, 1928 in Macomb, Mississippi. As a child, he played classical violin. Diddley was an admirer of John Lee Hooker. One of Diddley's contribution to rock and roll was the 5/4 rhythm pattern known as the Bo-Diddley beat. Many artists such as U2, The Who's, Bruce Springsteen, and many more used that beat pattern in some of their bigger hits. Bo-Diddley actually crafted many violins and guitars. One of the more recognizable guitars was his signature rectangular shaped guitar. Chuck Berry was born in 1926. Cited for influencing some of the biggest names in rock and roll, Chuck Berry was a constant innovator of the genre. Berry's influence as an early adult were the likes of T-Bone Walker, Carl Hogan, and Louis Jordan's Tampany 5, and of course, Charlie Christian. Chuck Berry was immensely influenced by the blues. Berry was able to meet one of his idols, Muddy Waters, who advised him to speak to the Chess Brothers about recording a record. What Chuck Berry was able to do was fuse all of the elements in rock and roll successfully. He is exactly the template that would later be used by so many others, including the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. Little Richard completely shook up the scene of the 1950s rock and roll era. Chuck Berry and Bo-Diddley were respected for what they brought to rock and roll, but Little Richard was the master of the crowd control. Even artists like Mick Jagger were surprised by how much power and influence Little Richard had over the crowd. The style of clothing and the makeup that Little Richard wore gave him a very unique and distinct appearance, apart from his contemporaries. During the era of the Jim Crow, Little Richard was cautious about the racism and the fervor of white women at his shows. Little Richard began wearing makeup to appear less threatening to hostile white audiences when visiting certain cities. Little Richard became so popular that he was not able to meet all of the scheduling requests, and at times he had stand-ins. So occasionally he would have impersonators such as a young James Brown, who was backing Little Richard, would routinely stand in when scheduling conflicts arose. Jimi Hendrix, James Brown, and Billy Preston were all backup musicians for Little Richard at the early points of their careers. When it came to live performances, Little Richard, much like Screaming Jay Hawkins, was an innovator who many succeeding artists began to emulate to control the crowd as well. Little Richard played with so much excitement that he would, on multiple occasions, break piano strings by hitting the keys so hard. The androgynous style and excitement that Little Richard brought to rock and roll would be something that many artists would mimic to some degree later on, from Prince to David Bowie, and even spilling over into soul.